Hey, everybody. Welcome to Show Me the Meaning, Wisecracks movie podcast that explores the deeper meaning behind the movies we love. And this is a bittersweet episode, Austin, much like the movie that we're covering.
Aw,
A little bitter, a
yeah.
little sweet. We're gonna be uh
We're gonna
we're
be
gonna be
killing
going
animals. Oh no, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Okay.
that's exactly what we're gonna be doing. Um we're gonna be going dark for the next 2 weeks for the holidays, but we will be back on January 7th. Perhaps with Nosferatu, Austin. I think I just looked it up. It
Gonna
comes
try.
out in Australia on January 1st.
Okay.
So maybe we can do that January 7th, or at the very least, we could do it January 14th.
Yep.
Um, I definitely want to squeeze in Nosferatu early in January. Um, we got some other stuff going on in 2025. We'll be having some guest episodes with other film podcasts, academics, online film critics, overall just kind of wisecrack types, you know. Um,
Nerds. Nerds.
maybe yeah, nerd stuff, maybe some nerd behavior.
Film nerds, book nerds, academic nerds. Yeah.
Uh, nerds of all stripe. Speaking of nerds, now this is becoming a thing where like in the middle of all the housekeeping, I just go off on a tangent. But speaking of nerds, the great Michael Burns put together a hell of a live stream last week. There was a 10-hour live stream that he did with a cavalcade of folks, myself included. I popped in near the end of it over on the Wisecrack main feed. If you haven't checked it out, please do. It was really awesome. I just want to give Michael and the whole team at Wisecrack their flowers because they raised a good amount of money for the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Um, so if you're someone out there who tuned into that live stream and you were able to donate, give yourself a pat on the back. You know, you donated some money to a really good cause, and I told Michael when I was leaving after we wrapped things up, like he did a hell of a job. You know, it's one of those things where like streaming for 10 hours ain't exactly digging ditches, but you know, it's not nothing. Like he was hanging in the paint all day long, had a great parade of guests, kept the conversation going, kept the listeners engaged, and like I said, raised some serious coin for a really good cause. Um, so yeah, check that out over at Wisecrack, and if you have a little extra money to throw around this holiday season, maybe consider donating some to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Um, maybe next year we have what's another thing to tee up? The best of the year. You and I will maybe go
Yeah,
toe to
we're gonna
toe.
do. Yeah, we're gonna do a best of or favorites of. Here's the thing. I,
Yeah,
I don't want to be one of those like nerdy, like, dude, it's art and it's subjective. But really, there is a lot of subjectivity that
yeah. Our
we have
favorite
to
our
think about.
favorite films is maybe more
Yeah.
appropriate. Whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and here's the thing, like I think about this all the time, and we talk about it in the comments below. Like my least favorite, my wife just brought me coffee. Say hi to Sean, everybody. Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you.
Sean.
Okay. Um, uh, my least favorite form of like film criticism is did you like it? Right? Or no, not did you like it? Well, did you like it or was it good?
Good or
Because I
bad,
just
thumbs up. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah, here's the thing. When Ebert did the thumbs up, thumb down
Sorry.
thing with Siskel or with who was it? Ropert was the follow up
Yeah,
act.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert,
The original.
the classic duo, and then after
Yeah,
Gene Siskel's untimely passing, Richard Roper,
their
yeah, stepped in.
their thumbs up, thumb down system wasn't just good or bad because they were so
Oh,
substantial in
sure.
how they understood film. And that's what I just want to encourage our audiences to do. Because here's the thing, I had to learn to think about film in this way. And now I just do it automatically. But I remember distinctively being in like university and hearing people talk about film in like these really deep, substantial ways. And I was like, man, I just don't think in film that way. Like I just don't get it. Like it did. But I learned and now I find it so much more interesting and so much more valuable to think about beyond just good, bad, like, dislike. Because here's the thing, a lot of times, like zone of interest, did I like it? We talked about this. Did I enjoy it? I don't
Ugh.
know if I enjoyed it in the sense that I had a fucking cinnamon roll this morning and I enjoyed the cinnamon roll. How do you compare the two? But do I think it was brilliant and profound? Did it stretch my brain and my heart? Yeah. Like that's a much more to me interesting way of thinking about film. So maybe what we'll do is what stretched our hearts and minds the most of 2024, Raymond. What do you think about that? Is
Yeah.
that too cheesy?
Yeah. I mean, I think without labeling it as such, in a way, we're already doing that. I think
Yeah.
at a certain point, this is a big thing in the horror community where horror fans are always going to be chasing that feeling of watching something as a kid and having their mind blown or being legitimately scared, um, or just feeling like they were watching something that was so transgressive and that like should have been forbidden or whatever. Um, and I think there's a version of that for every cinephile, whether they're horror fans or just movie fans more broadly, is that we're always going to be pursuing that thing, that feeling. I heard someone put it pretty succinctly that like I think it was a film critic, I can't remember whom, said something to the effect of like I don't hate movies. Like every single movie that I go to, even the ones that I'm pretty sure are going to be bad, I'm still hoping that I'm wrong. And not only
Yeah.
hoping that I'm wrong, I'm actually hoping that I'm about to see the best movie I've ever seen. Every single time that I sit down,
Mm, mm,
I
totally.
start with that expectation or at least that hope that like I may see my new favorite movie right now. And I think that can be tough to keep in mind, or it can be really really tough to maintain that sense of optimism surrounding the art form when maybe you're used to settling for this
We
or
get
that, or
burned
like
so many times. It's
yeah,
like being hopeful in love in a relationship when you're single, right? And you're like, man, I hope that this person is amazing. But when you get burned so many times, then you just get fucking jaded.
you know what's so great? You mentioned Siskel and Ebert. There was a clip. Hey, Peggy, chill out, babe. Chill out. It's just gonna make you cough, sweetie. Peggy, chill out, sweetheart.
Oh, Peggy
Um,
the dog.
yeah, she's had a cough lately. The vet doesn't know what to do about it. Hey, chill out, sweetheart. Relax, relax. Sorry, everyone. Um, the there's this great clip that would often make the rounds of Siskel and Ebert arguing very passionately about Good Burger.
Oh,
And
I remember that. Yeah, I do
if
remember
I'm
this.
sure if you
Yeah.
haven't seen it, like if you're listening or watching this later, feel free to pause it, go and you just click into Google like Siskel and Ebert Good Burger. It should come up pretty easily. Um
Yeah.
and I don't know if either one of them really likes the movie that much. Like, they don't seem to. Certainly, Siskel does not seem to enjoy the movie at all. Um, and Gene Siskel says that these characters are stupid, and then Roger Ebert is like, I entirely reject that framework. They're not stupid characters whatsoever. They save the day. They defeat the big burger chain. Blah blah blah. Like he's engaging with like the stakes of the movie as this
Yeah, yeah,
very like
yeah.
sincere thing to be like invested in
That's
on an
so good.
emotional level.
Yeah.
And it's just that thing of like he doesn't come out and go. And by the way, I think it's also a wonderful picture. Like I'm pretty sure I haven't
Mm,
watched the
mm.
entire review of it. I'm pretty sure he may just be like, yeah, the movie's not good, but like, how dare you say these characters are like? And I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
there's something so great about that. I remember the last time I saw it circulating on Twitter. This was years ago, I think. While I was still on Twitter, I retweeted that clip and I was like, this is why these guys were the best. Is
Mm,
because there was never a movie that was not worthy of discussion. Right?
exactly.
There were some movies that maybe they liked more than others or whatever, but they always found an angle, and I think that can be very, very difficult. I fall prey to this all the time, and, like, I try to cut myself some slack because I'm not a film critic. Like, I mean, I'm barely a podcaster. Like, you and I had our own podcast that is sort of just, like, limping along at the speed of my interest in it. Um but it's just one of those things where, like, I agree with you. That's a long-winded way of saying, I think any conversation is a little bit better when you try to engage with what the film is doing or what the film is saying, and
Yeah.
hopefully
And
you can find something worthy of discussion.
And I can't remember if I've mentioned it on this podcast. I know we talked about it on Cinematology, but so a friend of the show, one of our shows, I think Kier was on Show Me the Meaning back in the day too, but he was definitely on Cinematology. But a friend of mine who's a filmmaker in the UK, Kier Seward, he used to be like a really critical reviewer of films, right? Like he's a tremendous artist himself, but he also had like this really biting ability to kind of critique things because he knew what he liked and he knew what he thought worked and what didn't work. But as he's matured and made more movies and done a lot of work, and the guy's made, I mean, I've never met anybody who's made as much stuff as him in terms of like just music videos and short films, but he and his wife, they did their first kind of with their new rebranding together as a duo.
Mhm.
They've released their first feature, and he has learned a lot about how hard it is to make a friggin' movie, and he basically has come to the conclusion now that every movie gets 5 stars. He doesn't care if it's bad or if it's Apocalypse Now, but it gets 5 stars because it's really hard to make a movie. And he's like, I go in now with so much grace to these filmmakers that they had a miracle happened. Like they got their movie
A little
made
bit.
and distributed, and audience have seen it. Like what the fuck? And so he now goes in with such like a tenderness where he's like, even if the movie is not good, there's something that I'm going to be able to take away. A moment in the performance, the lighting in a shot that was interesting, an interesting sequence, something. He's like, there's something that is going to be praiseworthy because nobody makes a movie that gets it to that level. They can't do anything. Like, even like Uwe Boll, there's like some cool stuff that I've seen in his films, you know? I'm like, oh, that was some cool blood spatter in that or something like that, you know? Like, everyone has something that is interesting, you know?
Um, Speaking of interesting, we also have a letterboxed. I just got to burn through this because
Yeah,
we
do
always lose track of time up top here.
it.
At SMTM Pod over there on Letterboxd. Our community is growing. I think we passed 100 followers over there. Very cool.
Hey.
And I've said it before. If you want to keep the conversation going about any one of these movies, maybe jump in the comments underneath the individual movies that we've logged. If you have something to chime in, um, maybe that's a fun way to keep the convo going. And send any emails to wisecrack.smtm@gmail.com. We'll dip into the mailbag in future episodes. And while you're here, if you haven't already, subscribe to Wisecrack too, and subscribe to the podcast if you are listening on the podcatcher of your choice. Okay,
Oh yeah.
there we go. That's the last housekeeping intro of the year. We're here to talk about The Wild Robot, directed by Chris Sanders. I think his first name is Chris.
It is.
Let me double check. Immediately slowing down again as soon as we picked up ahead of steam. Directed by Chris Sanders, who also directed How to Train Your Dragon and Lilo and Stitch. Before we get into The Wild Robot, what do you think of some of? Have you seen How to Train Your Dragon or
Seen them
Lilo?
both.
Have you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear they're doing a live action version of Lilo and Stitch, which is going to be interesting because I'm
Hmm.
confused. And How to
Oh,
Train Your Dragon.
that's
That's right.
right, Henry. Yeah, no,
Yeah,
that's right.
both of
Thank
those.
you, Henry. Interesting. Is he involved in them? Do we know, Henry?
I mean, he's probably getting a little scratch. I mean, that's about as involved
Yeah,
as he needs to be.
he'll be an EP. Yeah, I actually really like How to Train Your Dragon. Lilo and Stitch. I think I was too old when I saw it. It just didn't quite. I didn't have the sensitivity to be able to enjoy it. Maybe if I revisited it now, I could find like some more juicy stuff. But I remember How to Train Your Dragon. I thought I think that those films they're really great. You know.
I
So
have seen How to Train Your Dragon once, and I remember I I don't remember a ton about it other than some of the obvious, like some of the bigger beats, some of the character designs and things
yeah,
like that.
yeah, yeah,
But I do remember really enjoying those big, like soaring.
yeah.
There's a real kind of
The
grandeur to
scope.
it. It's
Yes,
very
yes,
captivating. And
yeah.
I had never seen Lilo and Stitch until like maybe last year. That's one of Brenda's favorite movies. Certainly one of
Yeah.
her favorite animated films. And I really enjoyed that one. I think
Mm.
Lilo is a really a really fun kind of atypical protagonist, especially for a Disney movie. And Stitch, he's just a scamp. He's a rascal.
He's just no
Um,
rascal. That's
and
yeah.
there are some quotes from that have kind of worked our way into or worked their way into our sort of shared lexicon, especially like when we're talking about our dogs, particularly my dog, who's a little bit of a troublemaker. She has some Stitch energy that we like to call her out for now and again. Um, so yeah, The Wild Robot. If you haven't seen it, obviously this is your first and last spoiler alert. The movie, in brief, is about a sort of like she's like a service robot. She's a sort of protocol droid, voiced by Lupita Nyong'o, um, one of the great on-screen actors working today. Um,
Well, only
and
works very selectively, which is, I think, really interesting.
You know, it's one of those things that bums you out of like anytime. I was just having this conversation with Mallory the other day because there was this profile that came out about Barry Jenkins working on Mufasa,
Yeah.
and the profile is like equal parts. Yeah, we were trying some interesting stuff with Mufasa, and I'm never doing anything like this ever again.
Yeah.
And like it's kind of a weird
Mhm.
and sort of weirdly candid uh profile of a filmmaker working on a major motion
Which
picture.
which I think he said the quiet part out loud that we get on a lot of like these like really like really accomplished critical indie filmmakers who then make that crossover into like the Disney or the MCU world. And we kind of think like, are they doing this because this is going to create new opportunities and it's kind of like an instrumental good, or did Chloe Zhao really love and really want to do the Eternals? I don't know. I'm sure. I mean, she did her damn thing on it, but
She kind
you
of
kind of
did, yeah.
yeah,
But sorry,
but you
sorry, go
kind
on.
of but you do wonder if he didn't kind of like I said, say the quiet part out loud that you're kind of like, oh, maybe it's an opportunity. You know, people see this as an experiment. They got a truckload of money behind them. They're gonna try some things. They're gonna kind of make some money. They're gonna, and but maybe they're not gonna return to that kind of filmmaking.
Yeah, it's a piece on Vulture called How and Why Barry Jenkins Made Mufasa for Disney. I would recommend it to folks, even if you're not really all that interested in Mufasa or the sort of Disney live action machine generally. I do think it is a very intriguing peek behind the curtain of not only what the sort of studio process has in some ways become at this point in the story of cinema as an art form, but also like Austin was saying, just a little bit of that sort of devil's bargain and what happens to a filmmaker whom I believe to be genuinely inspired and incredibly talented. um I think he also kind of got a raw bargain with that movie, which is that because a film like that takes so long to make, he kind of signed on to that thing when there was maybe like 25% less cynicism and stuff surrounding the notion of
Yeah.
a filmmaker making, and now like 3 years later that the movie is coming out, I think that like cultural expectations of those movies have shifted so drastically toward the negative that
Yeah.
it's almost one of those things where like yeah, he kind of got caught at the exact wrong moment of like I mean the film industry, it's a very cruel mistress. I don't fault any filmmaker for wanting to like quote unquote sell out or whatever. Like you go and make one for them and it allows you to make one for you. Like this is a tale as old as
Well,
time.
also, Barry
um
Jenkins is also one of those guys who has taken his platform and elevated so many amazing up and coming
Absolutely.
independent
Yeah.
filmmakers. How much more cachet is he going to have? How many more connections? How many more people is he going to be able to introduce because of this? So I kind of do wonder if that's also something he knows, that he's becoming an elder statesman, so to speak, in the industry. He's a
A little
veteran
bit.
now, and he wants to take his platform, and I think he wants to elevate people, and I think that this is also going to allow him even more opportunities to do that. So I kind of think that
Yeah.
he's one of the real good ones out there in the biz, and I kind of trust him. If he did it, I'm sure he had really great reasons, and I think he's gonna take whatever he learned from this and use it for good.
Yeah, and I bring up the whole Barry Jenkins of it all because the feeling that I was uh, getting when I was reading that profile is sort of what I was discussing with Mallory was this notion of like, and we're not the first to have this conversation with any one of these filmmakers, is like, yeah, what was the movie that we lost in the 3 years they were making Mufasa, right? Or maybe even two movies that we lost. Like, were there two more Moonlights in him that we're never going to get
Yeah.
because he spent 3 years working on this one thing? And I think ultimately that's perhaps a sort of fruitless endeavor or thought exercise. But I sometimes think about that with Lupita Nyong'o, who is, I reiterate, I think one of the greatest living screen actors, or just, I mean, actors in general. Um, and most of her resume of the past decade now has been like Star Wars stuff, and I think she's perhaps in one of those Disney live action remakes. Like she was in the Disney Machine. I think she had like a movie in every sort of Disney silo, if I recall correctly, that she may have been in. Oh, she's in Black Panther. She's a voice in Star Wars, and I think she maybe is in a Pixar film, but that I can't put my finger on. Um, all that to
Re-
say,
Yeah.
uh,
Jungle
um,
Book. Jungle Book.
oh, okay,
She was a
so a live action Disney flick.
voice in Jungle Book.
And there's been some good stuff that has come out in there. Like obviously, she's extraordinary in Jordan Peele's Us. I really like Little Monsters, the horror flick where she plays a sort of uh, uh, a kindergarten teacher who has to take care of the kids and not only like protect them physically but also protect them emotionally during a zombie outbreak. Um, so she's done some good work here and there, but like the vast majority of her output has sort of been ruled by the Disney machine.
Mm.
And you can't help but wonder like how many great performances, especially because a movie is a lot less demanding, at least in terms of time, for an actor than it is for a director. I don't know.
Yeah.
Something to consider. I think she's
Mm.
exceptional in this film. I think she gives an excellent voice performance. I don't know if she's capable of giving a bad performance. We'll see. Like as her career advances. Um, but it is one of those things that like you can't help but wonder when a great artist is involved in these kinds of projects. Uh, Weird tangent aside, she plays a robot known as Roz through the majority of the film, who basically like crash lands on this island, encounters wildlife,
It's
and
like a post-apocalyptic future.
it is, yes. But for the most part, it's sort of contained to this one sort of hermetic ecosystem on this island that is more or less untouched by humanity. Um, so you get glimpses of sort of the ruins of humanity, and then the movie kind of takes a big leap, and you see more of that stuff later. But the central crux of the film is that she lands on this island and she learns to adapt to nature and the wild and a new habitat, um, and essentially kind of learns to override or otherwise sort of target her protocols toward a more harmonious existence rather than what she was, designed to do, quote unquote. In the process, she meets a little baby gosling, um, whose family it's implied, like not implied, like she lands on their nest at one point on
Accidentally.
accident,
Yeah.
and so she takes it upon herself to raise this gosling whom she accidentally orphaned, and then teaches him to all the things that his family would have been responsible for teaching him: how to fly, how to swim, how to migrate. And then eventually things take a turn for the worst. The corporation who owns the robot comes looking for her, um, and there is a sort of nature versus technology confrontation that the movie ends with. Um, but for the most part, this sort of like central underpinning of the film is, it's about parenthood, specifically a little bit about motherhood. Um, there's some stuff going on in there that I think is very fun and extremely funny at times. Good vocal performances all around. Um, yeah, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit more, but I'm kind of curious where you wanted to jump in on this bad boy.
Well, I was trying to think. I was like it gave me very heavy like Studio Ghibli kind of vibes, nature versus technology kind of thing, which is very often there in the Studio Ghibli films. It's like the red turtle meets, I don't know, something, something going on there. And then the more I've thought about it, I mean, I only watched it last night. But the more I've thought about it, I wonder if the really interesting reading of this film is looking at it as a story of humanity through and through. So there's a way of looking at it as being like, oh, humanity needs to
You and I may
figure
get
out
along during this discussion.
better ways to be in concert with nature. But I actually think that all of the animals are like placehold. It's kind of like Animal Farm, like it's an allegory for different types of human being. And what you
A
have
little
is
bit.
you have this island where everyone is trying to everything. They talk about it all this time. The Pedro Pascal Fox character talks about this all the time. That it's like, yeah, everyone's
Think
trying to eat somebody. Fink, yeah. And I think that it's a very sort of like Hobbesian state of nature, which is this idea that life is nasty, short, and brutish, right? And so you need the institutions to keep everything harmonious. It's kind of the bullshit reading of Hobbes, but whatever. We'll just take that's the kind of like archetypal standard reading of Hobbes. But it's still there, right? In a lot of ways of thinking that it's like, wow, human beings are just competitive and set to their own devices. They'll just kind of like eat each other. And so I think actually, if we think of the animals not as being animals, but as actually just being like types of humans in a society, like I think that it creates a completely different reading of this film. And then, of course, there is this idea of technology, but it's not technology as being like this it's not like AI technology. It's more about like technology run amok. It's more about like how do humans use certain ways of thinking about how they think they ought to be human in the world. And Roz, according to her initial programming, is purely task oriented. She cannot love, she cannot understand anything outside of just the task at first. And I think that there's something about like if that's what humanity is, if that's what society is, if you're just task driven, then you kind of become inhuman. You become a robot, right? Whereas the real like learning lesson, I think, for Roz is she learns how to be a different type of human, not because she sees animals like this is the old like romantic version, right, where it's like animals are harmonious and we can learn to be more like the animals. I don't think that's what this film is really doing. This film is more like, hey, um these anthropomorphized animals are actually just different types of humans, and the robot is like a distorted form of humanity, a humanity in run amok, neo feudal capitalism. And there are better ways to organize human society. And we're going to tell you that story in the kind of guise of robots and animals, but really, this is a human story through and through.
I think yeah, I don't disagree with your reading of it. I have a lot of problems with this movie, which is a movie that, with the exception of some stuff that made me laugh, mainly in the first half, I think the movie's much stronger in its first half than it is in its second half. Um, for a number of reasons. Chief amongst them, I think this is a movie that is fundamentally at war with itself and a lot of its own ideas. I've heard this movie compared to Ghibli quite frequently and often favorably. And I see that on an aesthetic level. Like Roz's design, for example, it seems very obviously influenced on the robots in Castle in the Sky. There's a clear kind of handshake happening there. But I think this is a movie that is like fundamentally colonial in its perspective. Um And I don't think you get that from a Ghibli film. I think this is a movie that regards nature as something to be admired more than respected. That there are
Mm.
these kind of lovely passive shots of not only the natural world, but the natural world kind of overtaking the built world. That the sort of remnants of human society have like vanished underneath rising ocean water, and you know, life is beginning to sort of reclaim these spaces. Um,
And the human city is like encased in some sort of biodome kind of thing, you know.
yeah, there's
So
like these bubble cities that, you know,
yeah.
I guess the thing that bugs me so much about this movie is that, and I don't think this is intentional necessarily, but whether or not it intends to, this movie is fundamentally saying on a certain level that, like, this robot, which, like all robots, is an extension of the human ego, knows better how to tame or manage the wild than the people, or on a literal level, the animals which inhabit it. But I would argue once again, on a metaphorical level, it's even more pernicious.
Mm.
Um, that, like you said, this is fundamentally about people getting along, and like I think that's pretty clear that there
Yeah.
is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
this is what I mean when I say the movie is
This isn't,
kind
you
of
know, like the Disney kind of like the old Disney idea that's like, oh, like animal nature is harmonious and humans are the ones who are bad, and if only we
yes.
kind of like, that's not what this film is doing, I don't think, at all. As a matter of fact,
I don't
it
think so. No, no, no.
no,
I
as a matter of
think
fact, like
it's
we see a lot of animal death. Animals are eating
that's what
fucking animals.
I was
Yeah.
just about to say. This movie has like a refreshingly candid relationship with predation and its place in, you know, the natural world.
The savage
And it doesn't,
nature.
yeah,
Mm.
precisely. Like
Yeah,
it
yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
make any, and in fact it like it engages with that stuff in very like darkly comic ways throughout the first half of the film, which is why I was so surprised at the emotional turning point in the movie where during this big snowstorm the robot goes out and pulls all the animals into a little hut so they can all sit around a fire together. And the movie completely lost me at that point, because it was like I thought this was a film, at least the first half of it feels like a movie that is kind of positioning itself as this sort of parable about a world that quite reasonably and for its own good is finally able to move past the sort of influence of humanity. And then there's this terrible sequence where, like, I mean, this island is not only teeming with life, it seems to be thriving. Like, this is Eden, right? If this
Yeah.
is a world that, as we see, is ravaged by the like catastrophic climate change, it's a miracle that this island exists. And not only that it exists, but like it's a closed ecosystem that has been there for, and I know people are going to say like this is a children's movie, you're overthinking it. What the fuck do you think the project of this
That's what this
podcast is?
Oh, that's what
That's
this
what we're here to
podcast
do.
is. We did Boss Baby many years ago, so come on.
Sure. But this island has been here for millennia, and ancestors of these animals have been there for millennia. They know how to survive a winter storm. And
Oh, so wait. So do you think
the
yeah,
notion
this is
that a
like
robot,
disrespectful to that? Is that the point? It's disrespectful to that?
I think this movie never meaningfully confronts the reality that Roz is like, she's this invasive, super intelligent super fauna
Mm.
who is completely destabilizing the ecosystem. It doesn't, the movie does not make a point out of this. In fact, the movie is like blithely endorsing it most of the time. Like, she makes this hut to put predators and prey together so that they can all fucking kumbaya through a winter storm. She rips up a bunch of like resources to make like a runway to teach one stupid duck how to fly. And also, like, why does it matter if he can swim or fly or migrate? He could just sit in the hut through the winter with everybody else. Like, that's what I mean when I say this movie is sort of at war with its own themes and its own ideas, is just like it seems to just do whatever is sort of narratively expedient at any given moment with a complete and utter disregard for how that undermines the sort of rich thematic underpinnings that I think it more or less earns during the first half of the film. And that scene in the snow is more or less the linchpin for me of like that's the point at which the entire movie falls apart. And they almost save it where like all the animals get pushed in there. It immediately is revealed to be a terrible idea, but then like a little speech gets everyone to settle down. And I was just like, no, you were about to make a good point that like there's never the moment in this film that happens at the end of E.T., right? Somewhat similar story about, an outsider entering, a suburban ecosystem and kind of throwing people for a loop. Even if it weren't for the feds coming to get E.T. at the end, there's this heartbreaking inevitability of it that this creature whom we love and whom we've learned to love through the eyes of Elliot and his family, this planet is killing him and he cannot stay here no matter how much he might want to. Like, and there's a real like earnest melancholy to that like you could have this beautiful friendship that has to be let go. Like that's what makes ET a great parable for sort of transition out of childhood and into adolescence. That, the world is full of great mystery and wonder, and you're going to start losing sight of that soon.
Mm.
And this movie never has that. This movie has the moment where the feds come to pick up Roz, but the movie never meaningfully confronts the fact that like Roz herself is a liability on this island. And I
Doesn't
I
isn't
once
that the
again,
point
I
where
don't
she's like
think this
they're
is
gonna keep coming, they're gonna keep coming back, and the animals are like, but we're
well,
gonna
no,
fight
but
for you,
like
and she's like, no.
no, because no, that's what I'm saying. The only reason she's a liability is because there's a company looking for her. No, the reason she's a liability is because she's like chopping down trees and throwing rocks around and pushing predators and prey together
Okay.
inside a little hut. Like that's the thing that like there's a whole sequence at the beginning which is very funny where she is like hunting animals for Fink to eat so that Fink will help her. Fink is this greedy little fox. Um and it's very very funny. There's a great bit where she's like using her laser pointer to create like a little crab boil. Um and at one point Fink is like having a conversation and he just sort of like casually like smacks a crab into the boiling water without kind of like thinking twice or looking at it. And like I said, the movie has this casual relationship with death and predation that I thought it was going to make like a broader point about that, but it throws
Mm.
all of that out the window as soon as it wants to have like a big cheesy
Sentimental, yeah,
sentimental blah blah blah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
just watching that scene up top is just like, oh yeah, she doesn't know from extinction. Like she could be hunting like vital resources on this small island to extinction to feed one greedy fox. Like, and that would be like, I don't necessarily know that you want to make the movie about that, but I don't think the movie ever confronts that notion that like she herself is the liability, not the. And so that's why I think it's kind of a misstep, similar to Wally, that I love the
Interesting.
opening of Wally so much, and then I think that movie gets a lot less interesting when we find out that humans are still kicking around. Like, I think this movie would be, and far be it from me to say like, oh, the movie should have been this or that. Once again, I don't think that's a very interesting form of film criticism or even film discussion. But what's frustrating is that they're constantly presenting these narrative pathways that I think could be like really productive and in line with what they're trying to achieve thematically, and then they sort of drive towards something else. A perfect example is that at one point Roz finds the remnants of other robots in this sort of lagoon, and she kind of rebuilds one to try and get to glean some information from it. The other robot, which is also voiced by Lupita Nyong'o, is called Rummage for the 10 seconds of the movie that it's in. And there's a really interesting tension that's introduced there of like Rummage has not been deprogrammed the way that Roz has. Rummage doesn't know from empathy. Rummage still defaults to the protocol. It's the difference between Woody and Buzz at the beginning of Toy Story, right? And for a minute, you're kind of like, oh, this, I still think the movie could do what it ends up doing with Rummage as the sort of bad robot instead of having the big corporations send the flying squid robot. I think it can still achieve those same goals and still have the big bombastic ending while still doing something that is like thematically consistent with the rest of the film by making Rummage the main foil to develop through the second half. And I guess that's one of the reasons the movie's so frustrating is that like the first half is so good and then I feel like it throws all that work out the window in service of like a conclusion that I think ultimately is saying like this robot, which once again is little more than an extension of the human ego, knows how to manage this place better than its indigenous stewards. And I think that like that makes the movie, intentionally or not, the movie is like inherently colonial in its mindset. And I do think that
Mm.
on a representational level, not just the metaphorical level, I also think it's largely problematic to send that message to kids in a world and a culture that is very desperately trying to get us to accept artificial intelligence and automation as like for our best interests. That there's this very kind of patrician attitude toward all this stuff of like people trying to convince us to accept a future that is like fundamentally anti-human. Um so I really, this movie left a really bad
Interesting.
taste in my mouth. I think there's some good stuff about it. It's cute, it's funny. There are worse ways to spend an hour and a half. There are also some issues that I have that are me problems, not the movie's problem, which is that like I don't give a fuck about robots under any circumstance. Like I don't care what happens to them. I don't feel sorry for them. Don't have empathy for
Iron
them.
Giant didn't get you?
I love Iron Giant. That's the one. Iron Giant kicks ass.
Okay. Okay.
Like, but here's the thing. I get that movies are fake and robots are very pliant metaphors, but when the movie is doing so much stuff that I find frankly like ideologically poisonous, I'm just like, no, fuck off, Roz. We don't need you. Like, let the
Mm.
animals run around and take care of themselves.
Interesting.
So
Okay. So a few things. One, I do think it's funny you talk about the bit when Roz goes around and collects all the animals from the snow and brings them into the hut. Sean turned to me and she goes, "Well, he just like ruined the food chain. You know, like what are all these
destroyed.
animals?
Yeah.
Are all these animals just gonna become vegetarian now, or
Yeah.
like have they all just become they've all just either they're vegetarian or they're gonna go extinct if they're not gonna eat each other?
And they pay
Um,
lip service to that where the bear is like, tomorrow I'm gonna
I'm gonna
hunt you
chase you
again.
tomorrow.
Just kidding. And it's like, well,
Yeah,
no, like you actually are though.
yeah, yeah.
Like
You
maybe
have
not the
to.
fox, he's gonna go eat salmon or whatever. That's the one big dodge they have is that the one real predator that they introduce, the apex predator is the bear, and like they don't have any cute salmon who are dicking around in the little hut, so like the bear is off the
Yeah.
hook.
So the bear's gonna survive, but everybody else is gonna die because they're not gonna eat each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I can totally see that reading. What I wonder is this is, and now I'm just gonna say this is what I think they were trying to do, and I think what they were trying to do was they were trying to say that we live in a world where technology is oftentimes sold to us as our salvation, but if you only think with your head, if you only think, rationally and, algorithmically, you lose the heart. And you got to learn to think with your heart. And maybe this is where this actually, I can see how this could even lead into your kind of critique of it being a tad problematic is that, oh, but look at indigenous lands. They know how to think with their heart. And so you get a little bit of the noble savage kind of thing because then Roz, she learns to feel with their heart, right? And like, think he wants to think with his he does think with his heart. He's been so ostracized that he hasn't been able to express it, and finally he gets embraced. But everyone, nature thinks with its heart, and corporations and bastardized forms of humanity only think with their heads, and if we can just learn to think with our hearts, we can love each other and we can come together, kumbaya. And I think that might actually lead into some of kind of like the critique that you're leveling against this film.
I think what you're saying though is that like even on a metaphorical level, once again, I think the movie is undercutting itself because what you just said or what you led off with was that notion that like i- i- that technology will not be our savior, that we need to decouple from that programming, and but like the same humans who destroyed the planet seem to have figured out all these little bubble biodomes where all their robots are doing like their harvesting and fruit picking and blah blah blah. Like we don't get a ton of glimpses at humanity, but like once again, I think it's fairly pernicious to imply that like the same species that completely destroyed the planet also was able to kind of like get their act together and cooperate enough to build these sort of majestic future worlds where life soldiers on. And I think that that is like very naively optimistic.
Mm.
That is not that's not the world that's being planned by the real people who are destroying the real planet. Like the world that's being planned by them is, I mean, fucking cop cities in America and Gaza's in the Middle East. Like it's just going to be like squeezing the lifeblood out of the world little by little, and it's going to line the pockets of a vanishingly small number of people while everybody else screams. And I think that's what's so distressing about this movie is that like it seems to have, or at least gesture toward, this kind of like appreciation or admiration for nature, but then it fundamentally, like I said, by the end of it is still suggesting that humans and the fucking machines and technology they create know how to use these resources better. And I just think that's fucking disgusting. Like
Can
it's
I?
just,
What do you think the ending? I am now. I'm thinking about this. The
and when I
very
say
end,
humans, I mean like corporate capitalism,
corporate
obviously.
capitalism.
Like there are plenty of humans who have respect for nature and who can envision and are working to build a future that is not mutually destructive.
So at the end, you get this interesting scene where it's kind of like, so Roz has to go back. So she goes back to the other world, the technological world, let's call it. And she goes back there, and everyone on the island, especially her little Gosling, is afraid that she's going to lose her memory, and she's not going to remember that she was able to overcome her programming, and that she was able to kind of live according to a different code, let's say. And of course, the geese, they all migrate south during the winter, and so we get this connection where they kind of reunite, and there's this moment where we think like, oh no, Roz has just become, whatever, 7134 again, or something like that.
Sure.
Rosam 7134. And then but then we find out at the end that there's an embrace, and she hasn't forgotten her kind of like deconstructing of her programming. Is it the sort of thing, like, do you think then, within your kind of interpretation of it, that like she goes back to the world of technology, like the dystopian futuristic bubble world, but that like the ecosystem, the natural ecosystem, is like left to do its own thing, and that like they've learned from each other, like the Gosling has found his people and his home, and he's not ostracized, and like maybe they go back to eating each other on the island, but maybe in like a respectful way. They learned from the
Yeah.
robot,
Upper
and the
Snowman.
robot, yeah,
Yeah.
and the robot them because it grew a heart, kind of, very yeah.
Your sound's cutting out, Buster.
Oh, is it still? Am I okay now?
You sound okay now. Yeah.
Yeah, and then like in a very kind of Tin Manny kind of story, Roz, she grows a heart now, and she hasn't lost, and so she's not like old Rosam 7134 or whatever the number is that we first met, but she's not the one that was just on the island that was all heart. She's kind of like integrated the two together, but in her own world. And so you have these two worlds that are kind of like, hey, we're gonna let that world be out there, and that's Rosalind's gift, or Roz's gift, right? Is that Roz? She's gifted to the ecosystem that that technology won't invade in the future. And then of course the island's gift to Roz is that you are still going to be a robot, but now you have a heart, you know? But like the worlds must remain separate from each other because they can't subsist alongside each other or something.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. The movie ends there, so it's one of those things where you can't really say either way. Like, um, does she grow? Like, they're doing a sequel to this. I think they just announced that they're going to do
Oh
the Wild
yeah,
Robot
of
2,
course,
which I'm
of
sure
course.
Roz will lead the machine revolution, and um, I'm
Yeah,
sure I'm sure that one will be really well thought out and uh, like environmentally conscious. Um, Yeah, I don't know. I mean, what you're describing to me is just one of those things of like, again, as we understand the robot character to be a metaphor for humanity, um, yeah, I guess, but it's also like this is where I have a really tough time because I'm just like, I don't know, it's still just a robot. Like this, eh, and I don't mean to be like flippant or reductive or whatever, but I guess that's the thing. It's like Citizen Kane, right? We find out at the end of the movie what Rosebud means, that he was thinking of this sort of childhood innocence. It was the last sort of memory as he passed away. It was the last word on his lips. But like that that doesn't mean like retroactively his life was any less rapacious or destructive. It's just, a glimmer of humanity and perhaps regret at the kind of like dying of the light. I don't really know how to interpret that with
yeah.
a robot who is like not dying but is like back to doing robot shit. Like I don't really give a fuck if a robot remembers some duck she met. Like I just don't. Like and that once again, I know that's a me problem, but I also think it's just one of those things that again sort of just actively undermines what the movie is about of like the movie at least in the first half really seems to be about parenthood and learning that like the ones that you love by necessity eventually have to let go and be their own people and have to move beyond you, and in many ways like that's the best case scenario when you're a parent, is that you raise someone who is independent enough to not need you anymore. And there is something very beautiful and melancholy about that reality, but I don't think it can map on to the ending of this movie, which is just like, well, but actually sometimes when you're a parent, you need to like wipe your memory of your kid and go back to work in a fucking space bubble. Like it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny, which is why it's just so frustrating because like once again, I think the movie is going through all the motions of it feels like a J.J. Abrams movie. Like it knows how to imitate emotional catharsis, but it doesn't really know how to earn that in a way that is like narratively consistent or anything. Like the end of what's his ET movie called? Super 8,
Super 8.
where the whole movie, this kid has like a locket with like his mom's picture on it or something. It's like this memento of his mother who passed away when he was little. And near the end of the movie, there's something going on in Super 8. I've only seen it once. I haven't seen it since theaters. There's something going on in Super 8 where like the alien's a magnetic or something. I don't know. Who gives a shit? But at the end of it, like his little locket sort of like swings from his neck and he grabs it. And there's like a really, honestly, it's kind of an affecting moment. It's an interesting image where like this kid is like he's reckoning it's the ET thing, the fucking bikes in front of the moon. Like there is some mystery and some beauty left in the world. Um but then for seemingly no reason he goes, "You know what? You can have it, alien. I don't need the last fucking picture of my mom or whatever." Like it's just it's just something like that where in that movie I remember feeling like, what does that achieve on a narrative level? Like what does that achieve on a thematic level? Like I think it's okay to have a picture of your mom. Like I
Oh,
think
she's in his heart, bro. She's in his actual heart. He
no,
doesn't need the locket.
Well, but that's the thing that, like, I guess maybe a generous reading of the movie would be saying that, but, like, in my mind, I think it's one of those things of, like, "Hey, memories are fragile, and maybe you should cherish them." Like, and it's just one of those things where, like, I don't really even think J.J. Abrams could, effectively articulate what he's going for by making the kid let go. I think he just feels that it's the most cinematic thing to do in that moment, which I think is, like,
Mm,
sort of fundamentally
mm-mm.
dishonest. And that's sort of how I feel about this movie's
Okay.
ending of just like,
Okay. So here's the
okay,
thing.
yeah, the duck
Yes.
flies back to the space bubble,
Yep.
but like, okay.
I did think this. I did think that the film is very economical in its storytelling. It moves like it's moment to moment, beat to beat to beat. It doesn't let you breathe at all. And because of that, I felt a little like bludgeoned by the drama, by the kind of cinematic story beats. Like it just moment to moment. Like here's this thing, and then it's this, and then this, and you're like, whoa! You couldn't even breathe and let things settle. And maybe this is where like the studio, as you're saying, Ghibli films, where
I've always
they're
heard
so
Ghibli. Is it Ghibli
successful.
or Ghibli?
I have no fucking clue. I've heard Ghibli, but
Hmm.
especially the Miyazaki films. Even though I love the Red Turtle, and that's not a Miyazaki Ghibli
Mhm.
film, but I love the Red Turtle. But they operate at a pace, and they let you sit with the characters so much more patiently that I feel like you get to kind of like actually deal with the depth of their internal motivations and their struggles. And this film, it seemed to bounce so quickly that I did feel like it was a little bit like I was being force-fed cinematic and dramatic, um, like they wanted me to feel a certain way. I felt really tossed to and fro, and it didn't land as much as I thought it would. Like, we talk about the Iron Giant, like that. If you don't fucking break down in the Iron Giant, then
Love the
like
Iron Giant.
you just like that movie. Like, come on, those the Miyazaki films, like Totoro, like just fucking. I know that's not one of your favorites, but like that movie just breaks me down,
Yeah,
and
like, yeah, we don't need to get into a whole thing about Totoro. Like,
yeah.
here's the thing about every Miyazaki movie is just like, even the ones that I'm not crazy about, I realize that it's just like, oh, well, it's just like, it's not my tempo. It may not be for me, but I still like, I've seen Totoro several times, even if I'm not crazy about the movie, I can still enjoy that film just as like an artistic experience, even though
Totally.
I'm not like fully emotionally linked into it the way that I am for something like Princess Mononoke or The Wind Rises.
But he's so great with developing character and dynamics between characters that you
Certainly.
really
Yeah.
care about the stakes for each of them. And I think this film, and of course it's meant for children, right? And but it is one of those films that it's meant for children, but I think adults can enjoy it. But it moves so quickly that it does make me worry that it's like feeding a kind of like you say, you're worried that it's kind of like slipping a certain kind of ideology in the back door. And because the story beats are so dramatic consistently, I don't think that people would even pick up on it. I think that, and that's kind of one of the insidious things about what art can do, right? Is that it can feed us certain ideas, even though we're not aware of them. And this one, especially because it's got such big, sweeping, cinematic, dramatic beats, I think that you get swept along and like, oh my, they're going to the beaver's going to help them now, and then it's this person, and then this, and then the bad guys are coming, and they're
Yeah,
clearly the bad ones,
the
and it's the
beaver's a
good ones.
perfect example. The beaver's a
Yeah,
perfect example of like, thank God this beaver was being needlessly reckless and destroying like the oldest living thing on Earth, so that we could use it to prevent some other destruction later. Like we could just like knock it over and just be like, yeah, all right, well we did that. Like it's just, I think this
yeah,
movie in many ways is just like really deeply pernicious.
so
Um,
interesting. Okay, let me let me park your critique of the film because I think there's something interesting in there, and let me then think about how I'm thinking of this film as kind of like an Animal Farm. And what I mean by that is like, this is like a human allegory. So if it is a human allegory, right, then I think one of the things that the film is trying to do in a way very similar to what the Miyazaki films do, but I think that they do very well, is to okay. Let me just say this: the Miyazaki films that I think are so successful. We made a video on Wisecrack a few years back when we used to do on the Wisecrack main channel when we used to do a lot of the philosophy of, and I actually did the philosophy of the Miyazaki film. So I watched like all of the Miyazaki films that were out up at that point. Obviously not the Boy and the Heron, but one of the things that we know that cuts through a lot of his films are he does have like he sets up this real division between like industrial society and like a love of nature. And there's like a Shinto religious kind of undercurrent that is very much there and very palpable. That also has a real like a certain way of understanding humanity's place in the world. And and then also there's something about like childlikeness that Miyazaki really wants to celebrate. That there's a wonder not only with like the imagination and like fantasy, but also with like a viewing of possibility for life and society and relationships that is just so optimistic and hopeful and filled with possibility and love and tenderness and kindness as being like the best of what it means to be human, right? So if we take that as like the standard bearer, and we can't deny how impactful the influence of his films have been over, especially animated, right? But even cinema more broadly, I think. Um, and so if we look then at the Wild Robot, and I think it's trying to do something similar. I do. I think it's trying to say there is a bastardized version of humanity that is taking over reality, and it is the advanced capitalist technological system that is plundering the planet and that is kind of like causing us to be fractured in our relationships with each other and not be able to have respect with nature. There's no integration with like the natural world around us. And so if that's the case, then we look at the island, and the island I think could be viewed as basically like a world without a world without like a certain type of connection with each other. Now, here's where the problem is. The problem is that it makes it seem like it's an untouched, like indigenous society, and then of course, like the foreign invader comes in and is like, actually, I'm going to show you the better way to do things. I think that's absolutely right. I think what they're trying to do though is something that's more like in a world where where creatures can't communicate with each other and listen to each other and find some sort of way to work together to get along, what you get is you do get a world of violence. You do get a world where there isn't harmonious participation. Simultaneously, for Roz's world, the technological world, is if there's a world that is just purely about like task and doing things, but without understanding why we do things, without understanding the human motivations, we might say, behind things, then you just get like a technological world, and that's a world of kind of like no feeling, no heart. And I think that by bringing them in communication with each other, what you get is you get the world of advanced civilization that is able to learn how to grow a heart, and then you get the world of kind of like competition and rivalry that is able to figure out how it is that we can work in concert with one another. And I think from that perspective, a nice thing that could be taken away, that I think that the majority of kids are going to take away, and the majority of people are going to take away, is like, well, look what happens if we try to find the more tender parts of ourselves and respect each other. Don't just view us as in competition with each other. Don't just accept your essence, like I'm a fox, you're a bear, therefore we fight. Don't just accept you're a goose that doesn't have his nice big plush wings, you're therefore an outcast, right? And I think that that's like the sweet that's the sweet animation designing principle that I think the film is really trying to lean into. And I think that most people, because this film has got like what fucking 97% and it's gonna probably win the award for best animation and yada yada. I think most people are really tapping into that. And I don't have a problem with that. Like I think that's actually like an okay thing on the veneer to kind of like have as like a superficial reading of a film, even if what you're saying might also be true at a more pernicious level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I also just think that message is also undermined by the film itself. Like that's the
Mm.
thing is like I don't think I'm being nitpicky about this. I think like I just think the movie is very thematically inconsistent. That, I was fully cognizant of the fact that I was watching a meta. Like, this is not a movie that is about robots teaching animals to get along or whatever. It's only that in the literal sense. Um, but I think that all that stuff is essentially undermined by the fact that, like, within that metaphorical structure, like, what is the analog to a big ship coming down and blowing everyone up the moment they start getting along?
Like, oh, I
Like,
better
is
go
that
back to work.
yeah, like, is that just the hammer of institutions coming down to break solidarity or whatever?
I have a question
Um,
for both of you because
Yeah.
something I was feeling, especially in the first half, I think ultimately the movie like is doing what Raymond says. It's undercutting its own themes. I think because of what Austin brings up with its focus on plot, it just keeps moving things so fast. It doesn't really take time to consider them. But I don't know. Did you all have any kind of a pro-life or abortion readings on it as well, as far as like the burden of
So
taking on the
interesting.
child regardless of the choice, and like how that's ultimately like the right move, and you know the destined like great life the kid is going to have.
Well,
you
there's
know,
definitely and there's definitely like a pro vitalism in this film, which is actually some people would argue. So there's a philosopher named Gilles Deleuze who has written a co-series of books with Felix Guattari, and there's this movement that's called vitalism, and it goes back to like Felix Revison and a bunch of like other individuals prior to that. But one of the things that is leveled against these individuals is that they prioritize life to such a degree that like all life is somehow viewed as being like a good thing, and sometimes vitalists might kind of veer into like we must enhance or speed up or increase the perpetuation of life at all costs no matter what, and life is therefore good. And I think sometimes like even like pro natural like pro nature types can like they can kind of fetishize like life sometimes, where it's like anything natural is beautiful and good, and anything that has to do with life is somehow it needs to be upheld no matter what. And I think that there is something potentially dangerous as that can be a trap, you know.
Yeah,
yeah,
and I
and I
question how the movie, you know, it has that sort of theming in the front end, and then in the back end when Ross is back there working her job. Like, if that wasn't her goose, would she call the laser bots on it? Like, why is there a
yeah.
corn death camp? I don't even think you see actual people running anything. It's all
Well,
robots.
and how interesting is it too that like Raymond was saying at the beginning of the film, you've got this fox that is like, I'm going to use this robot to actually enhance my ability of killing animals and eating them. But by
Right.
the end, it's like no more death is allowed. Death is not allowed anymore. You know?
Yeah, that's well, once again, yes. But to your point, Henry, the pro-life reading, I would say that was like, if the movie is suggesting that, it is once again in conflict with it, but maybe it comes back down. Maybe there's a parabolic curve to it that, like,
Yeah.
the to me the movie is so cavalier about death and the quote unquote like natural order, especially in the first half of the film. I would strain to see that reading. But then if you impose on this film a kind of like natural hierarchy, and I don't mean just like a food chain, but a moral hierarchy, I think that once again you may be pointing something out that just feeds into sort of colonial implications of a lot of this movie, which is just that, like, no, it's not just that some animals naturally prey on others, it's that they're right to do that, and that, like, there are so many tail off of what you're saying with regards to a pro-life reading. There's so many religious people, I was raised around quite a few of them, who regard this planet as like a gift to be used and destroyed if we so choose. There is like that the sort of implications of divine providence are that if there's a reason that we were put here, then we have every right to, you know, be irresponsible stewards of the gift and the land and the bounty we were blessed with. Um, and I think if you read this movie as like Roz is essentially fucking God on this planet, and Fink is a human, and a lot of the other mammals are humans because they're the only ones who are meaningfully anthropomorphized. They're the only ones who have voices. Like, all the little fish and the crabs and the scallops and the oysters, like all of them are
Mm.
there to just be devoured at Fink's whim.
Yeah, I
And
do find it
I do
curious.
think that's consistent with a pro-life reading of it, of just like, there is a sort of overall kind of divine providence angle to it that I think doesn't necessarily negate what you're saying.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up. I do find it curious, like what you were talking about with the utility of forms as well. That it's like in combat that Roz takes on the forms of animals, and it's like, well, what's the utilization there? Or what are you teaching yourself these skills and tasks for?
Yeah, there's something interesting.
Yeah.
So in theology, there's this idea of what was called the great chain of being, and it comes out of like Neoplatonism, which is this idea that there's like higher life forms, and the higher life forms, culminating in like humanity and angels, they kind of go up the chain of being, and they're closer to the divine, right? But as you go down the chain of being, then you get to like scallops and crabs and things like that. And there is definitely a great chain of being on this island, right? That the scallops, the crabs, the oysters, the worms, right? When the little gosling, Brightbill, when he starts snacking on the worms, they don't have agency. But mammals, they have agency, and birds, they have agency. But yeah, there is something, a kind of great chain of being hierarchy that's established on the island as well.
Funny enough, this is something that I was just thinking about because I was reading an article about the founding of the American Museum of Natural History, which was founded by this guy Henry Fairfield Osborn, who was like a world-class piece of shit. Whose work is kind of instrumental in how we think of history, because like every modern museum owes a kind of debt of inspiration to his original founding of and how he laid out the American Museum of Natural History. Like he was the first person to like make dinosaur skeletons or recreate fossils in the sort of like shape. He uh pioneered like um sort of like natural dioramas for taxidermied animals to inhabit that would give you. And in addition to all of that, he was like a fucking racist and eugenicist, and had in addition to like those helpful and educational and still influential exhibits, also had exhibits like essentially mapping the sort of evolutionary progression of life, not through natural selection, but through this kind of like, not really theory of signatures. I don't necessarily know what you would call it. People much smarter than I have written about it, and I can't really remember the words they used for it. But basically, organized a lot of exhibits to suggest a hierarchy of life from like invertebrates up to basically white people. And
Mm, mm,
I'm
mm.
pretty sure that anyone who's listening to this can imagine some of the stuff that preceded the white people on in these sort of like sort of species hierarchies. Um, and I just like kind of can't help but just feel a certain residue of that when I watch this film. Like, there are some animals who deserve to be brought into the hut, and then there are
Mm.
some fucking animals who I guess just deserve to live out in the snow, which is apparently so fucking deadly you had to
Mm.
wake up a hibernating bear to escape it. Um,
It's so, it's so
furthermore,
interesting. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
oh no, you go ahead because I was gonna change the subject to something totally different.
Well, so talking about the kind of like politics of museums, and there's a great movie that I want to recommend to people. It's called Angelo, and it was directed by Marcus Schleinzer, released in 2018. It's an Austrian, Benelux, Luxembourg, Belgian film, and it's a biographical drama about the life of Angelo Solomon, who was an African-born man who was brought to Austria in childhood as a slave in the early 18th century, but then he rose to become a prominent figure in Viennese society in adulthood. Really interesting film because now I don't want to kind of spoil the film too much, but historically it's true that Angelo's body was taxidermied and put on display in a museum after he died, and it was kind of used to show not only like how you could tame, a barbarian, but also to show you that actually once a barbarian, always a barbarian kind of idea, right? And so when he's on display in the museum, amuse the kind of wealthy in Europe at the time who would come to see, what such a person might look like. But it's a really beautiful film, really interesting in the way that it deals with this precise thing that you're talking about. And it kind of shows you just how it is that the system of imperial colonization, how it has viewed the natural world and the inhabitants that have maybe lived in a non-Western way for many centuries. But a really interesting film, and it does deal with precisely the museumification, if you will, of like hierarchies of beings. So really interesting.
Um, I haven't seen Angelo. I need to watch that because that's I think the second time you've recommended that to me. We've talked about that movie outside of this, and I still haven't watched it. Um, what I was going to jump in and also mention, just to kind of like bring it back to questions of like automation and artificial intelligence, that this movie is just
Yeah.
kind of like is kind of dabbling in. It's not really. I don't really think you should take this too seriously as like a a depiction of artificial intelligence. Um, there is a Swedish philosopher named Nicholas Bostrom. Are you familiar with
Yeah.
this guy, Austin? Yeah.
Yeah. He
So
he, he writes on like data and like big data
Mhm.
and small data and stuff. Yeah.
he has this theory of instrumental convergence, which he illustrates with a thought experiment known as the paperclip maximizer. Are you familiar with this?
No.
I'll just read from Bostrom here. Suppose we have an AI whose only goal is to make as many paperclips as possible. The AI will realize quickly that it would be much better if there were no humans because humans might decide to switch it off. If humans do so, there would be fewer paperclips. Also, human bodies contain a lot of atoms that could be made into paperclips. The future that the AI would be trying to gear towards would be one in which there were a lot of paperclips, but not necessarily any humans. And I can't help but think about this when I'm watching a movie like The Wild Robot, because the whole fucking thing is like, okay, she's gonna teach this duck how to fly and swim or whatever. And to reiterate, she's doing some immensely destructive land moving in order to facilitate that goal. But the movie never characterizes that as anything other than like just cutesy old robot hijinks. And I just think, once again, for a movie that seems to be suggesting that like technology can be dangerous and over reliance on it can be dangerous, seems to have a very blinkered perspective with regards to like how inherently dangerous its main character is or its protagonist is. Um, and in a way that, like, once again, I think is just kind of characteristic of this entire film, that it's just confused and non-specific. It has this really fucking muddled thematic foundation. And I am not like I'm not anti-automation. I'm anti-capitalist. Like, if we can have all the fucking automation we want, like I would love to live in a world where people don't have to break their backs doing hard labor, but then, the surplus value of that automated labor is being distributed to the people who otherwise would have done those jobs before. I think it's pretty reasonable to say that, like, yeah, that's maybe how things should work. That someone whose job is replaced by a robot shouldn't have food taken out of their mouth, because what what does that accomplish? The robot doesn't need to eat. The robot doesn't need a break. Like, why isn't the money that that person used to get paid still going into their pocket? And I know that people are conditioned to, not our listeners, of course, because like I think if our listeners were conditioned to think like socialism bad as a rule, they would have just stopped listening to this podcast when it first premiered. um, but I think it's just one of those things of like, as we hurtle toward, whether we like it or not, an increasingly automated future, it's important to recognize the battles that lie ahead of us to make sure that the gains of automation are distributed not just proportionately, but equitably. And I think that's going to be a very, very difficult fight because the history of American capitalism, just capitalism in general, is, less for you and more for me. And I think that this is a movie that kind of like ultimately sort of suggests that that's just fine. The
Well,
system needs some adjustments, but the system itself does not need to be destroyed. That like
do
this
you
is a
think
movie that presupposes a technocratic future could be one of like harmony and salvation, or at least those are the glimpses that we get of the sort of remnants of human society that like they may be their lives may be different, but they are more or less harmonious. They seem to have kind of figured it out, and I just cannot stress enough like that's not that's not the world that's being built.
maybe the film is also trying to critique like a way of thinking that is just purely task driven. So like if you are just trying to achieve, then you miss out on something else. So maybe even when Roz is building the fucking runway and all this other stuff, she's thinking about it in the wrong way. Because remember, at the end, she completes the task when Bright Bill is able to fly, and she says task
Great
complete,
Bill.
but she's still empty, and they still haven't learned the final lesson. And the final lesson is something else, right? So maybe the achievement of the task is actually problematized, and the idea is that with onset of AI and advanced technology and machine learning, et cetera, that if it's just purely driven to achieve, but we're not asking what we're trying to achieve or why we're trying to achieve it, then you run into certain problems. And I think Roz, maybe even in all of her achievement, she doesn't really find fulfillment because she's learned how to feel. And she realizes that, wow, actually just accomplishing protocols and tasks is not sufficient, you know?
Yeah,
So
sure.
maybe
That's
there's
that's
something.
like nominally what the movie is about, but once again, it's undermined by the fact that Roz actually does have a job to do, and it's like picking oranges for humans. And
Well, that's the interest.
I
Yeah,
think
that's why I don't know how to read the end of the film.
well that's what's so frustrating about it, and it comes back to that notion of like for me the more I don't want to say like what's better or more interesting, but the more narratively consistent version of the movie is one in which humans do not exist anymore, and these
Mm,
robots which were purpose built are left with a world where
mm,
they are essentially rudderless, and they have to like they are like forced into a box at which they have to reprogram in order to find any meaning, because that's all they're optimized to do, which is why I think the movie would just be far more thematically interesting and consistent if it were if Rummage were the ultimate foil for Roz rather than Vantra. What's the Stephanie Shu character's
Contra.
name?
Yeah.
Vantra. Vantra and the overall corporation that sort of descends with her.
Mm.
And that's just the thing that's like frustrating about this is like all the pieces of a thematically or ideologically consistent movie are right there. And I don't think that would make it any less marketable for kids. I think like it would still be about robots doing robot shit and cute little animals doing cute little animal shit. Like it would still be it would maybe be like 10% more challenging, but it would also be like 25% more coherent. And
Mm.
I just think that like having humanity still existing and Roz still having like a discernible higher protocol in service of humanity completely undermines, like I said, virtually every single other aspect of the film.
Well, maybe we have to put an ellipsis at the end of this and see what the fuck the end of the film is supposed to tell us, and we won't find out until The Wild Robot 2 in
Like I said,
2026.
similar to artificial intelligence, some art is just very good at mimicking emotional catharsis. Some art is
Mm.
just good at like this filmmaker is a very talented filmmaker. Like How to Train Your Dragon, I think is a good movie. We talked about this early on in the film, which is like, look, I'm not fucking successful by any traditional metric in the film industry, but I am a professional screenwriter, and trust me, I'm good enough to fake my way through a writing assignment. Like,
Mm.
I know the beats of a screenplay well enough. I know how to sort of mimic a kind of surface level emotional catharsis. I've fucking done it. I've gone through the motions. I've punched a clock. I've turned in scripts that I'm not proud of
Which
and
scripts?
cashed
Which
my check.
scripts, Raymond? Which
Well, let me tell
films?
you
No,
right
no,
now.
no, no, no.
Um, so it's just one of those things where like I'm very fortunate in that like my experience making movies has really not, I would say, really not affected my experience watching them, which a lot of my friends can't say the same. Like a lot of my friends will watch a movie and just be like, "Oh, what light's coming in there? What are they doing here? Blah 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 blah."
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Most of the time when I watch a movie, I'm still able to kind of like I'm able to turn off that sort of part of my brain and just engage
Same.
with the narrative as a narrative. But fucking hear me when I say watching this movie, I was like, this guy he kind of faking his way through this. Like I know like lazy half-ass sort of, purpose-driven screenwriting when I see it, and because like I've done that shit. You cannot bullshit a bullshitter, and this is a movie that to me just feels like I said, it feels like it's going through the motions of emotional catharsis, but I
Mhm.
think that is a sort of kind of a fitting meta narrative on artificial intelligence in general. Like there's
Mhm.
nothing there's nothing behind the little lenses. It's all just computation. It's all pattern recognition. There's no
Mhm.
real emotions. There's just mimicry.
And maybe that's why
And
the heart of the film didn't get me in the feels as much as I was actually anticipating it would, because I'm a sucker for this kind of story. So why did it not get me in the guts as much as I thought? And maybe it's precisely because of what you're talking about.
I
Maybe it
don't
was a little
I don't know.
paint by numbers. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Well, speaking of painting, I do think it's worth acknowledging. This is a lovely film to look at. Like
Yeah.
I think there is a lot to be admired with the movie, especially in that first half. There's some clever writing, some funny gags, and the movie does look really really great. I would rather watch a movie like this than I guess there's a lot of American animation now that sort of feels sort of samey. A lot of people for a long time that sort of Pixar house style became the aesthetic that a lot of people were chasing, and now it feels like yeah, there's a school of animators who are kind of opening up to new ideas or new ways of doing sort of old techniques. Which you can read about some of the making of this film. It's kind of interesting, and there's no doubt a lot of care and passion and attention to detail that went into this movie. I just think like a lot of things regarding machine ethics, it it really you know it's maybe a little bit lacking. Like I think
Mm.
that's one of those things that today's robber barons and captains of industry really want people to believe that algorithms are this they're essentially stone tablets handed down from the gods that they will always be able to call balls and strikes. They know the difference between good and evil, and that there is a sort of fixed morality that we can program into them. Don't fucking buy it. All of these things are made by people. They are extensions of people's personalities, people's biases, people's bigotry, and people's hangups, et cetera, whether consciously or subconsciously. Um, and I think that ultimately this movie sort of buys the lie of the technocratic future that like, oh no, eventually we
Mm.
will create a computer that is smart enough to correct all of our wrongs. If we're the ones creating it, it ain't gonna correct shit. Um, so
Real quick, just for people if they're interested in reading more about this, there's a really great little manifesto book called Inventing the Future that was written in like 2016, and it basically
yes,
talks about full automation, but from an anti-capitalist perspective. And there's a lot of literature out there about like sometimes it's stylized as fully automated luxury communism, or like fully automated luxury gay space communism, or whatever else has been teased about online. But the book
I'm
Inventing the
curious,
Future, it
Austin, if
yeah.
someone was too busy to read an entire book and maybe they wanted some of the ideas just kind of uh laid out for them in a more digestible format, maybe something that's like 90 100 minutes long, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's no version of it like that.
I'll be completely honest. We did make a film adaptation of this. I'm not
You're
sure it's more
kidding.
digest. I'm not sure it's more digestible. It is an experimental avant-garde feature, and I am not sure it's more digestible than just getting the book. But obviously, you can watch our movie as well. It is out there on YouTube for free, Inventing the Future. Hour and a half, and you'll be able to check it out. But especially if you're into like weird avant-garde montage cinema shit, give it a watch. But I think check out the book too, because you were talking about full automation, and one of the things that the authors, Nick and Alex, really want to do is they want to think about like how can we use automation to benefit humanity in a way that isn't just going to line the pockets of the corporate elites. And I think that's a discussion worth having. And whether or not we agree with everything that the book advocates, because I too am a loving critic of the ideas of the book. I still think that there's something really worthwhile in discussing in that, because it really does touch on a lot of the stuff that we talked about in this episode. And I think a lot of the stuff that the film is trying to hint at and that contemporary society is trying to deal with. So check it out.
Before we wrap up, just a little fun stuff. On Letterboxd, they give you the stats, the breakdown of all the movies that you watch in a year. And because we have a Letterboxd profile for this show now, we may not have done that many movies in the few episodes that we've been back, but we've covered 13 films this year, 9 of which were from the year 2024. And I'm curious if you can put this together. Obviously, we covered a couple John Hughes movies in one episode, so he is our most watched director with 2 films. There is one actor who has been in 2 films that we've watched. I'm curious if you can think of him.
Pedro
There's a hint.
Pascal.
It's a him. There you go. It's Pedro Pascal.
Yeah.
Got it in one.
Pedro Pascal. Yeah.
So he's quite winning in this film. I think he's very funny as Fink the Fox. But yeah, just a little fun tidbit at the end of the year to kind of look back on some of these movies that we've covered. And we've got more coming for you in 2025. Like we said at the top of the show, we're going to be dark for the next 2 weeks for the holidays. So everyone out there listening, happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah, happy holidays, happy New Year, all of the above. We hope that it is a happy and healthy and restful holiday season for all of you. And thank you all for listening. This has been it's been a blast to come back and do Show Me the Meeting again. We're excited to kind of keep the ball rolling next year. Like we said up top, we're gonna make a bit more of a habit of bringing guests on, maybe crossing over with some other film podcasts. Getting wisecrack friendly folks, academics and film critics and the like on here. Maybe doing some more best of the year stuff from 2024 before looking forward to the new releases of 2025. Maybe talking some Oscars, once those nominations come out. We'll see how it all breaks down. One thing's for certain, it'll be a lot of fun. As always, I'd like to thank our producers, Matt Keebler. We got Henry Arambidi on the 1s and 2s. You heard from him on this episode. And then, of course, the big boss man himself, Michael Burns, the big cheese. Thank you all for listening this year. And again, if you have a chance, do some scrolling around on that 10-hour stream over there on Wisecrack 1. It's a real blast. Michael did some great work. And if you have a little extra scratch this holiday season, check out the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. Until next year, folks. Austin, you want to send them out? Any parting shots?
I do want to say that last episode we talked about Australian traditions, and we had someone comment on some Australian Christmas traditions that I forgot. Yeah. And there's prawns. They love to eat prawns in Australia for Christmas. So does Fink the Fox, and Santa on a surfboard. So yeah, things and Meijer Christmas windows. Apparently, so Meijer is like a department store here, and the big reveal of their Christmas window, their decorated Christmas window. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Australians and their upside down Christmas traditions, since we didn't get to spend as much love on that last time, because it's not all about white Christmas. Not everybody on this spherical planet gets to celebrate a white Christmas. Some people, they have sunny Christmases. So just wanted to share.
I can't remember. Does Wake and Fright take place during the Christmas break?
Oh God, it's during the summer
Or
break,
is it
right? So
or
it
is
would
it the
be.
s yeah, because it's the summer
No, it
break,
would
which
be. It's the summer
in
break.
my
Yeah.
head, it's reversed, but because it's
Oh,
down
fuck.
under.
So is Wake and Fright the greatest Christmas movie of all time? Is that what we're
It
saying?
might be. I was about to say, because you're talking about Australian Christmas, folks, if you're out there listening and you need a little, maybe some non-traditional Christmas viewing this year, you want to switch things up a little bit, check out Wake and Fright because it is a fucking living nightmare. And trigger warning, if you think there's fucking animal cruelty in The Wild Robot, my God, brace yourself. Maybe don't check out Wake and Fright. So
Yeah.
once again, an episode full of contradictions. um,
Uh,
all right.
Happy New Year, everybody. We love you.
Yeah. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. Take care, and we will see you in 2025. Be excellent to each other.